This program is based on a version of real events and includes dramatized elements. It contains disturbing images related to the investigation into the deaths of 9 hikers. Viewer discretion is advised. In 1959, deep inside the Soviet Union, in the Northern Ural Mountains, a place so remote it sits near the invisible line between Europe and Asia, 9 experienced hikers set up a tent on a frozen slope. What happened next is not a legend. It's documented, it's photographed, and it still doesn't make sense. Because sometime after midnight, they did something no trained winter traveler would ever do. They didn't unzip the entrance, they didn't put on boots, they didn't grab coats. They cut their way out of the tent from the inside in multiple places, like the door wasn't an option anymore. Then they walked into a blizzard in socks, some of them barefoot, in temperatures around -30 Celsius, with winds strong enough to peel heat off skin in minutes. And the official file, the official Soviet conclusion, tried to reduce all of that to 2 words. They froze. Case closed. But if that's true, why did 9 capable people choose certain death instead of the one thing that could keep them alive? Their shelter. This is the Dyatlov Pass Incident, and every time someone thinks they've solved it, one detail refuses to fit. Their leader was Igor Dyatlov, 23 years old, not a reckless kid, a disciplined organizer. This was a high-difficulty winter route, the kind of expedition you don't attempt unless you know what you're doing. The group wasn't made of strangers. They were students, engineers, athletes, people who knew cold and knew fear and knew how to survive. There were supposed to be 10 hikers, but one of them, Yuri Yudin, turned back early because he got sick. That one decision made him the only survivor. Later, he would say something simple and chilling. If I had stayed, I would have died too. They kept diaries. They took pictures. They joked about the weather, about sore feet, about food. The last photos show ordinary things: snow, skis, a tent, faces that still believe tomorrow is guaranteed. Then the weather changed, visibility collapsed, wind hit the slope like a living thing, and instead of dropping down into the forest line, they pitched their tent on an exposed mountainside. People argue about why. Maybe they were tired, maybe they misjudged the terrain, maybe they didn't want to lose altitude, or maybe something already felt off, and they wanted to camp where they could see, because the mountain had a name the locals respected, Kholat Shachel, often translated as Dead Mountain, and on the night of February 1st, Dead Mountain earned it. The group didn't return on schedule. In the Soviet Union in 1959, delays weren't unusual, but when families started asking questions, search teams were formed. It took weeks, because the terrain is brutal, and the weather does not care how desperate you are. After 26 days, they found the campsite. And at first, it looked almost normal. The tent was there, partially collapsed, snow packed around it. But as they got closer, they saw the fabric. Long slashes, not one, several. Cuts that started low and went upward, like someone had been inside and didn't have the patience to be careful. Inside the tent, the scene was worse. Warm jackets, extra layers, supplies, food. Everything you would grab first was still there. Their boots were near the entrance. Their coats were inside, meaning whatever forced them out did it fast enough and scared them badly enough that they chose frostbite over staying one more second. Outside, the snow preserved something even more disturbing. Footprints, a trail leading down the slope, toward the trees. Not the scattered chaos of people sprinting in every direction. A line, as if they left together. As if someone was leading, as if they were trying not to make noise. The first bodies were found near the forest edge, 2 of them, near a cedar tree. barely clothed, hands damaged, as if they'd been tearing at bark, trying to make fire, trying to climb, trying to survive. Above them, broken branches high up, 5 meters, as if someone climbed the tree to look out into the darkness, to search for the tent, or to watch something on the slope, or to get away from something below. Not far from them, there were signs of a fire, small, weak, the kind you make when you're shaking too hard to control your hands. Then they found 3 more bodies, between the cedar and the tent, as if they tried to go back, as if the initial panic had passed, and reality hit them like a hammer. We need the clothes. We need the shelter. We need to get back. They didn't make it. They froze, within a few hundred meters of safety, faces into the snow, bodies positioned like they were still moving, when the cold simply turned them off. 5 hikers found, 4 still missing, and the mountain stayed silent. 2 months later, the last 4 were discovered in a ravine under deep snow. And this is where the story stops being a tragic accident and turns into a nightmare puzzle. Because these 4 weren't just frozen, they were damaged. 1 had a skull injury, 2 had crushed ribs, severe internal trauma, the kind doctors compare to a high-impact collision. But on the outside, there were surprisingly few wounds, not enough bruising, not enough torn skin. It looked like the force came from pressure, like the body was compressed without being cut. And then there was Lyudmila Dubinina. Her face had missing soft tissue, including the tongue and eyes. That detail alone has fueled horror stories for decades. Some people hear it and think, violence, torture, something unspeakable. Others point out something colder and more realistic, that after weeks in the wilderness, animals, water, and time can remove what is soft first. Nature doesn't do it with hate, it does it with hunger. But even if you accept that part, even if you accept a harsh, natural explanation, you're still left with the core question. Why did they flee? Why did they cut their own tent open? Why did they leave boots behind? Over the years, the case became a magnet for strange details. Some reports mention a strange discoloration of skin on some bodies, a tone that looked unnatural to grieving families. Some clothing items reportedly showed traces of radiation. And then there are the accounts you can't fully prove, but also can't fully erase. Stories that the area was restricted, that authorities arrived quickly, that the investigation was pressured into silence, that documents disappeared, that certain pages were stamped and sealed and hidden for years. In the Soviet era, secrecy was normal, but secrecy plus 9 dead hikers creates a different feeling, a feeling like the mountain was not the only thing being protected. So what happened up there? There are theories, and some of them are terrifying, even when they're true. One theory is an avalanche, not the cinematic wall of snow people imagine, but a slab avalanche, a heavy layer that breaks loose and slides like a concrete plate. If the hikers cut into the snow to level their tent, they could have weakened the layers. Hours later, wind could load snow above them, building pressure, and then a sudden release, a violent ooter, a punch of weight against the tent. The kind of impact that could injure ribs without slicing skin. The kind of moment that makes you believe another bigger slide is coming. So you cut out, you get downhill, you reach the trees, you try to regroup, and then the cold finishes the job. That explanation is clean, it's modern, it fits some pieces, but not all, because even if a slab hit the tent, why did they spread out the way they did? Why didn't they return immediately once it got quiet? Why did some stay by a fire while others went toward the ravine? And why the feeling, the unmistakable feeling, of panic so intense it erased survival instincts? Another theory is wind, a brutal, rare wind event that can happen in mountains. Sudden bursts that create pressure, sound, vibration, and even the sensation that something is moving outside your shelter. There's also a concept people love to mention here, infrasound, low-frequency wind noise, the kind you don't hear like a normal sound, but you feel it. Some researchers suggest it can trigger anxiety, nausea, a sense of dread, even hallucinations in extreme cases. Imagine you're exhausted, dehydrated, half asleep, and suddenly the air itself feels wrong. The tent shakes, the slope groans, the sound becomes a pressure in your chest. Your brain starts screaming one message: leave, now. And you do. Not because you're weak, but because panic is older than logic. Then there are the darker theories: military tests, secret weapons, a stray explosion, a shockwave. Because this was the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and the Northern Urals were not a tourist zone. Some locals and searchers later reported seeing strange lights in the sky around that time: fireballs, orange glows, distant booms. Those accounts are debated, but they persist because they match the way this case feels. Like the hikers weren't just fighting nature, like they were reacting to something they didn't understand and couldn't outrun. And this is what keeps the Dyatlov Pass alive. Not one theory, but the gaps, the choices that don't look human unless you accept that they were terrified, because you don't cut open your only shelter unless you believe staying inside equals death. So picture it. You're inside a thin tent wall on a frozen slope in the Soviet wilderness. Wind is hammering the fabric like hands. Snow presses down. Someone is drifting asleep. And then, a deep odor, a sudden weight shift, a sound that doesn't belong. The tent bows, a pole snaps, someone shouts, another voice answers, and then the decision happens in seconds. Not calmly, not logically. You cut, you crawl out, you move downhill. You don't go for boots because boots take time. You don't go for coats because coats are behind bodies and gear and panic. You go because whatever you think is happening, you believe the tent is the trap. And once you reach the trees, you look back, and the slope above you is black, and the wind is screaming, and your breath is loud. And maybe you realize something even worse. Maybe there isn't a second avalanche. Maybe there isn't an enemy. Maybe you left because of fear, and now fear has replaced your shelter with open air and -30 and a mile of uphill death. So you do what humans always do. You split, you try options. 2, try to keep a fire alive. 3, try to crawl back to the tent. 4, try to find cover. A ravine, a place the wind can't reach. And in that chaos, the mountain doesn't need a monster. The cold is enough. In 2020, decades later, officials revisited the case and leaned toward a natural explanation: avalanche or snow slab, panic and exposure. And maybe that's the truth. Maybe it was physics and bad luck. But even if it was, this isn't a story that ends clean. Because the question isn't only what killed them, the question is what scared them first. What made 9 trained hikers do the unthinkable at the same moment, in the same tent, in the same night. And that's why, 65 years later, Dyatlov Pass still feels like a door that never fully closed. So tell me what you think. Avalanche, wind, infrasound, a military accident, or something we still don't have a name for. And if you want more true mysteries told like horror, subscribe, because the next story makes this one feel like a warning, not a mystery.